안녕하세요, Cloud입니다. Hey guys, Cloud here. Today I have a guest on my podcast. Her name is Reen. She's been learning Japanese for about 5 years. She has her YouTube channel. I'll put the link of her YouTube channel and her Twitter down below so you guys can check her out. But she's been learning Japanese for quite some time. So I asked her about, how she got into language learning. And her story is a lot of us can relate to, and just the way that she went through it. And at the very end, I asked her, okay, well, if you had a redo button and you could start all over again, how would you change? And it's always nice asking that question because it really gives you a perspective onto what people found, like, oh, this works for me, and this is what I would do if I could start all over. So it's really nice to sort of, get that perspective. The other thing is, I don't know why my microphone's acting up, but you'll hear during the interview that her mic is loud and clear, and mine is not loud and clear for some reason. It's loud, it's just not clear. I tried fixing it post-interview, but I don't know how to fix that. So, sorry about that. Hopefully my mic... I don't know what happened that day, but hopefully that doesn't happen very often. Alright, so I'm here with Reen. Reen, if you could introduce yourself briefly to people listening.
Hi, my name is Reen. I have a YouTube channel called ReenBenkyou, where I basically chat about learning Japanese, basically. That's basically it.
When did you start learning Japanese?
I started learning it properly maybe about 5-ish years ago, I think.
Oh wow!
But, yeah, so it's been it's a slow but a long journey.
What got you into Japanese?
Well, it might be a bit of a stereotypical thing for someone learning Japanese, but I was introduced to the Japanese language via anime.
Oh.
Back when I was a teenager, I had a couple of friends who watched anime, and they started me watching it. It's entirely their fault. And that was at the time, that was my only knowledge of Japanese, was this, very one-sided look at what the Japanese language is. But then it was like a few years after that those same friends, they actually started taking Japanese lessons. And I was really impressed with them being like, oh, wow, you're doing Japanese. That must be so difficult. And then inspired in their language learning, I actually tried to learn Spanish, strangely enough. I still had, because I had learned Spanish as part of like secondary school education. So I assumed that like Spanish would be the most likely language that I could learn. So that's why I chose Spanish. But surprise, surprise, I still don't know Spanish. But then funnily enough, it was a few years after my friends had stopped learning Japanese. They had stopped going to classes. That I started to kind of be like, well, maybe I could do that. That sounds fun. That sounds interesting. I had started I'd continuously been watching things like anime, so I'd always been hearing Japanese, and I started to like the sound of it. And then music as well. I started to enjoy Japanese music. And then finally that curiosity of like, let me just try a class. I wonder if there's a class somewhere local to me. And then I finally decided to take a little lesson in Japanese.
Oh wow! So it was a lot of baby steps that led you to it. It wasn't like one day you were like, you know what, I'm learning Japanese. It was a lot of things had to happen over the years, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wish I could say that there was some sort of epiphany moment where I was like, oh my gosh, Japanese is amazing. But no, it was slowly over many, many years that I decided to dip my toe into the Japanese swimming pool.
Just out of curiosity, what was the first anime you got introduced to?
Oh, gosh. Gosh, that's going back some years now. It's probably... Oh gosh, what were my friends watching back then? Probably something like Sailor Moon was probably one of the first things.
Okay.
Maybe, I want to say Tenchi Muyo, or what was that called? Yeah, it was a few, funnily enough, they got me to watch some shows like that. But I was like, okay, this is cool. Yeah, sure, it's fine. But I wasn't like, I love anime. It wasn't until I decided to take a stab at watching Full Metal Alchemist, that original series that came out years ago, and from watching that one was when I was like, oh yeah, I love anime. This is the best.
Yeah, that's a really good anime. I agree.
Yeah. Even today, even like after like watching so many more anime shows since then, I still say that that's my number one show that lives in my heart.
Yeah, it's the number one for quite a few people. It was really good. When I watched it, it was like a whole new world into anime for me too. So when you started learning Japanese, what were your expectations? Because you tried to sort of learn Spanish beforehand, and that didn't really work out. So did you like go about the same method, or did you like try the same thing, or was it you just had more motivation and more of a reason? So like the same reason that stopped you from learning Spanish didn't really apply, or how did you go about that?
Well, I think at first it was very similar-ish reasons. Like I don't like I think most people around the world, I always had this notion of like, oh wow, wouldn't it be cool to speak a second language? I'm sure like everyone has that little thought. And so I think I had that kind of thought when I tried to learn Spanish. But of course, like that's a little bit of motivation, but that's not the real sort of chunky motivation that you kind of need to like really dive into a language. So that petered out. I had a similar one going into Japanese. I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to learn a bit of Japanese from just like one of my animes? But yeah, so I think it started out being very basic like that, and the method of trying to learn Japanese was very, very stereotypical. Like I will write several dozen vocabulary lists over and over again. You know, like I will just use a textbook and that is all I will do. You know, all the sort of things that nowadays a lot of people will advise that you don't do, or at least you just do a little bit of. You don't make that your whole sort of process. But I think nowadays my Japanese learning, like my study sessions, look a lot different from that. Nowadays, like I still will use get my pens and my notebooks out and do a bunch of writing, but I try to have a lot more variety, I would say, like listening, both passive and intentional. Like I will be like, oh, here is a video where I'm going to listen to this Japanese teacher on YouTube speaking Japanese, who's trying to teach Japanese. And then I will also be like, yeah, I'm just going to watch an episode or a movie, you know, just mainly for my own enjoyment, but still have it in Japanese. I also, I'm not very good at it yet, but I've been trying to produce more Japanese online, both in videos and also on social media. So like I have my regular, say like my Twitter account, but then I have a Japanese Twitter account, which when I remember, I try to like only tweet in Japanese. So, you know, trying a, you know, I guess a lifey life way of putting Japanese into my life, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, like people tweet every day, but, you know, maybe sometimes try doing that in another language. Trying new ways to produce the language, new ways to try and like take in the language. And yeah, not just like I have textbooks, and I do use those, but then I also try to I try to read manga in Japanese. Just really trying to have as much variety as I possibly can. So that's like a big difference from when I started to what I'm doing nowadays, you know?
Yeah, it seems like you're a lot more immersed. You're doing more things rather than just a classic, open a textbook, here are some flashcards, and basic approach that we take when a lot of people start learning a language.
Yeah. The change came, I think, when I really started to fall in love with learning Japanese. It was like when I like before, it was just like, oh, this might be a little bit fun, and then there was a change, and it became like, oh, I haven't studied Japanese in a couple of days. Oh no, I miss it. Where is it? Where are my books? My kind of, I guess, relationship with Japanese changed, and once that happened, that's when I started to like actually look up things like, how do you learn a language? What, people who are successful, what do they say that is a good way to learn a language? And that's when, I really started to change how I would learn a language, kind of getting everyone's tips and tricks, and then being like, okay, well then how can I turn this into my study method, sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Right. When I fell in love with it, I changed how I interacted with it.
That's cool. That's one of the things I was going to ask. I was like, what changed in the 5 years that you went from basic, just studying from a book, to now you're watching movies in Japanese. Whenever you get a chance, you're reading manga or you're doing something in Japanese. So it's cool to see that exactly when that happened.
Yeah. I almost like before, when I was just like learning Japanese as a little side hobby, I think I could more accurate, if someone says like, why are you learning Japanese? At that time, I would be like, oh, because it sounds nice and I think it's a bit fun and what an interesting thing to know. And nowadays, for that same question, I would just be like, I don't know, man, I'm in love with this language. It's too late. I can't go back.
That's funny. So, I guess this could be my last question. So you've given a lot of really cool insight onto just how things have changed for you. It's a lot of times it's like, at what point, because a lot of times people will start learning a language and they'll, kind of like with Spanish, they'll stop because all they know is basically studying another subject, where it's like, okay, I'm just going to do some exercises, I'm going to open a book. But what sort of shifts them from taking it from it being just like a study to more of like a lifestyle, like what you were doing with your Twitter? Actually, before I ask my question, is the Twitter account that you tweet in only Japanese in, have you found that helpful? I've seen a lot of people use it, but I've never done it myself, so I'm not sure what, if it's like you find it very helpful, you find it somewhat helpful, you find it like a supplement, like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, personally, I have found it helpful, even though I haven't been as consistent with it as I would like to be. But I do find that it's like I think it's important to try and find ways to use the language, right? Because once you start using it, it kind of gets better ingrained in your brain. And I think finding a few different ways to try and use the language can be very helpful, especially if you integrate it with with what you do anyway in your first language. So like it could be like talking to people, talking to friends. It could be doing tweets. It can be doing Instagram, searching on YouTube, but like try and search for search for it in your target language. You're doing what you would normally do, but you're just doing it in the language that you want to learn. And I find that useful. Like, sure, like writing a tweet doesn't seem like much of a language practice because it's just like a little tweet. But it, that's one extra thing that I've done in that language than I would have done. And I think, I think once or twice I have had people like tweet back at me and be like, "Oh, hey, by the way, you slightly spelt this wrong," or like even a Japanese teacher might be like, "Oh, hey, well done. That sentence was very well done," and it kind of it can give you a bit of motivation back, and it can, I think it can, motivation wise, practice wise. I think it can be very helpful.
That's good to know. My last question. So I used to read a lot of Japanese manga in English, but then I got into Korean. I started learning Korean. I started reading a lot of Korean manga or manhwa. And I noticed that in Japanese, there's this very common, genre called isekai. Yeah. Basically, someone getting transported into another world. There are some Korean mangas like that, but I found that they also have a genre that I didn't really see in Japanese. It was more of like when the main character gets up to a point, a wall, something tragic happens, and then he wakes up and he's back in his like 12-year-old body, or like when he was just forced born. It's sort of like going into the past, and now he's like, okay, I'm gonna do it right this time.
I think, isn't that like Tokyo Revengers right now?
That's my next anime to watch, actually. That's so funny. I think
that's a similar sort of thing. Like he's back, huh? Like, yeah.
I think was it called ReZero? No, Zero was like that, wasn't it?
Zero?
I think it was the main character would. Anytime someone would die, they would like go back.
ReZero, yeah.
ReZero, yeah.
Yeah, ReZero is technically an isekai, but yeah, when he dies, he kind of steps back.
Not that one. There's another one where he ends up going all the way back into the past as a child to figure out who killed his mom. I don't remember. It's I think it was called Zero, but I might be confusing its name with ReZero. But yeah, if you could go back right before you started your language learning, and you had to do it all over again, and this time you were going to do it, way better than last time, and you had to set yourself up for success in like the perfect environment, what would your ideal sort of language learning routine or just starting off look like?
Oh gosh, I think I would definitely... I think I would try not... I think I would start doing things a lot earlier than what I did before. So I think I would not be afraid to like do things like start kanji earlier, start trying to read earlier, and definitely start trying to speak earlier. So I think maybe one of the main changes I would have would be more conversation classes on something like italki, for example. I would definitely, I think an ideal language learning environment will have you speaking a lot and listening a lot. So like I have a bad habit of like just doing reading and writing. I'm a very booky person. Mm-hmm. So I think my like an ideal language learning environment would kind of have me out of my comfort zone, perhaps. More speaking, definitely. More listening, definitely. Like, listening is my worst skill, I think. And then, goodness, I think if I could do anything, I would love to actually be in Japan studying Japanese. That would be my super, super ideal. Yeah. That because then you'll just be surrounded by the language. Like where I am now in the UK, there's only so much Japanese I can surround myself with, you know? Like, if I go out to the shops, then it's nothing but English. Whereas if I was in Japan, if I went to the shops, then I would have to, say hello and thank you to, the shop workers in Japanese. So yeah, I think being in Japan, surrounded by Japanese, would be my like ideal perfect Japanese environment, I think. Yeah. And then ideally I would have loved to have made my earlier Japanese learning a little bit more like what I do now with the variety, because then I think my progress would have been a lot faster. A lot faster. Yeah. I think those are the main points for my perfect language language routine.
That's a really awesome perspective, especially the part where you said like a perfect environment for me would be putting myself outside of my comfort zone. That's something you don't realize until way later on. At least for me, when I started learning Korean, it was like that. I didn't realize I had a comfort zone. I was just like, oh, I'm just learning the language. And 90% of my language learning was reading manga or manhwas. And I didn't realize that, when I tried reading just regular old text, that 90% of the words that I'm comfortable with aren't there. So I'm like, okay, I'm just not going to read that. And I'm only going to read, manga. And then after a while, you find yourself very good at a specific niche, but you've never like broadened your horizons. And then you start talking to people and like, why are you talking like you're in the 1950s? It's like, I don't know. I thought that was a regular word.
Yeah. You do need to. It's nice to have your little comforts and things you feel comfortable doing, and because that does sometimes make language learning like not feel stressful or anything like that. So I think have that for sure. But yeah, as you say, like you need to step out of that zone, whether it be not being afraid to speak in your target language where other people can hear you, especially other people who know that language can hear you. You need to be able to try and do that, even if it makes you feel really uncomfortable. And yeah, sometimes different, as you say, you might be really comfortable reading one type of thing, but then something else, you're like, no, I won't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well,
I think in my early, my early language learning, like there were of course some words that I was more interested in learning because that's where my interest was, like Full Metal Alchemist. I remember being like, oh, I love Full Metal Alchemist. I wonder what the Japanese name is for that. So I was in a situation where I knew how to say Full Metal Alchemist in Japanese, but I couldn't say, excuse me, where is the nearest station? Like, like if I'm in Japan, I think one of those sentences is going to be more important to know than the other.
Full Metal Alchemist is probably more important.
Yeah.
That's quite funny. Yeah. I had a very similar thing where I didn't know how to say the word dice, but I could tell you what the word for eye prowess was. But yeah, thank you so much. I think we've come to time. If there's anything that you felt like you wanted to share or something that maybe I cut you off or something you wanted to add here at the end, I wanted to just give you that opportunity. If not...
No, nothing to add. Just thank you so much for allowing me the time and space to natter on about learning language.
Thank you very much for being on.